I go back to Jean de Cete, who I quote a lot, who's a neuroscientist, and he says this emotional resonance, just like you feel bad, I feel bad. That's not empathy. I mean, you can define it as that. But he says empathy is when you have self-awareness and emotional regulation. And to me, that is the full, more the full-fledged empathy. So it's like, you are never that person. There's always going to be a border. There always will be a difference. But it doesn't mean that difference is unbridgeable.
Welcome to Season 15 of Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand that the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. Thanks so much for watching. Enjoy the show. Welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. I am joined today by Dr. Susan Lanzoni, who is a writer and historian of psychology, psychiatry, and neuroscience, who teaches at the Massachusetts College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences. She received her PhD in the history of science at Harvard and has taught courses in the history of science for over 20 years at Yale, Harvard, and Tufts Experimental College. She is also the author of Empathy, a History, which won the Cheron Best Book Prize in the history of the social sciences. Congratulations. Her writing has been featured in The Atlantic, American Scientist, Psychology Today, and The Washington Post. I am so grateful to have her join the show. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you so much, Anita. Really happy to be here.
I just want to point out to anybody who's watching and for those who are listening, I'm holding up the book with, more than a dozen little stickies where I've got pages full of underlines and things that I want to revisit with Susan. I was gushing with her before we pressed record that I'm a huge fan of her book because I think it is the primer that anybody who wants to dip their toes into understanding empathy and its evolution over time must read. I'm not just saying that. It is a must-read book for people who care about the topic of empathy. So thank you for having written it.
Oh, sure. Thanks.
I was saying earlier, it was published in 2018. My dissertation came out in 2011, and I wish it had been around in time for my writing. So maybe you can share, my sense is that the book kind of looks at 9 periods of empathy research, empathy thinking, and maybe without dipping into each of the 9 sections, what surprised you in doing all of that research about empathy? What surprised you as you were working on this book?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that intro. And I kind of wish I got my book out earlier too. It took me. But I guess the surprising thing was when I even discovered how empathy was translated in its original meaning. And just by way of quick anecdote, I was doing, some dissertation research and looking at Swiss psychiatrists who were doing kind of early existential psychiatry. And the German term Einfühlung came up as a kind of part of the doctor-patient relationship, as a manner of treating the patient on the part of the doctor. And so, of course, I was trying to translate all these German terms and found that was translated as empathy, and then began to look into the literature. And it had only been translated in the early 20th century. And there was a couple different translators I later found out. The first translation was empathy, Enpathy, and that was misspelled. And so then it came out the next year, 1909, as empathy. But the original meaning was just so different from what I had understood empathy to be. So that, I think, was the most surprising thing. And I thought, this is really strange. How can this concept be so different? And the original concept was basically circulating in psychological aesthetics in late 19th century Germany. And it was about feeling in. Einfühlung is in feeling, so you feel into form. But mostly it's kind of this projection of your own feeling. So you might animate, a mountain, you might feel a mountain rising because your feeling of rising is kind of translated into that mountain. Or, even anthropomorphizing like water trickling, streaming or moving or running. that would always also be kind of a sense of our own experiences, feeling and movement, and transferring those into objects. Art was also, Einfühlung was an idea of like, we got pleasure by doing this transfer, and that's why we found certain things even beautiful. So it was really an aesthetic idea. So that also fascinated me. I thought, how is this connected to, the notion we have as empathizing as just understanding someone else's feeling? So that was my entree into it. And then, of course, I had to track every, bit of it and how it got translated from the German to the English. And that's also a story of German psychology, experimental psychology developing in the late 19th century. And then they had to translate all these terms for other laboratories. So that was part of that story. But I tracked it then over the course of, the past 100 years or more. And it was really just an academic term for quite a long time. Once it became empathy, it was used just, it entered psychological textbooks like in the 30s, but it doesn't appear in Webster's till 1944. That also kind of shocked me. I was like, what? Hasn't this idea been around for a long time? And you could argue that similar ideas, Adam Smith uses sympathy in a way that's similar to empathy. So it's not totally unknown, but it does have this very particular history in the 20th century.
And I remember when doing the research about the aesthetic origins of empathy and feeling into sort of art, that it was actually a really subversive movement, because at the time there was this rigid way of looking at art objectively, and you could decide what pieces of art were superior to others. And this tradition that believed in the power of Einfühlung, feeling into, was like, why are we giving so much privilege to like this linear way of objectifying a piece of art? Why don't we elevate how we feel in relation to that art? Why don't we elevate that a little bit into our relationship to art? Now, I never studied art, so I always feel a little bit gauche. I don't go to the museums and sort of, sit there and ponder in front of a beautiful piece. And I feel always a little bit gauche saying that. But I remember having the sentiment when I learned about that if we give ourselves permission to feel and be aware of how we're feeling in relation to a piece of art, that is sort of the origin story of empathy.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think it is about this subjective objective moment. Like, you're in the moment with this piece of art, and what are you doing to your, how are you perceiving and how's it affecting you? And it's kind of almost circular. And that is kind of critical to sort of how, these theorists were talking about the beautiful. And there's a whole field of psychological aesthetics. Like, why do we see certain things as beautiful? Like, if it's symmetry, or why does our eye follow a line in a certain way? And a curved line is more pleasurable than, maybe a straight edge or something like that. So there were a lot of research and actually studies done about this, because it's like, how do we as humans perceive art and get pleasure from it? So it kind of has its heyday in the, late 19th century, early 20th century, but then that sort of view is critiqued again. And then the object has to become important in and of itself. And it doesn't really matter so much how we are feeling or perceiving. So there's like these sort of trends in art history. And again, not that I'm an art historian or anything, but the whole empathy thing in aesthetics kind of diminishes by like the 1920s. So that's not even like as current at that time. But
and then it got picked up by the psychology folks, right? And then there was this bifurcation. So let's talk about this. This is what I remember from the research, but you tell me if I'm wrong. Where the psychologists took empathy along two tracks. And that bifurcation still exists out there a little bit. This idea that we feel what someone else is feeling, right? The affect empathy, and then the cognitive empathy, the idea that we can take someone else's perspective, we can imagine what somebody else is experiencing. And that research had its own sort of moment in time, right?
Yeah. So just I would take it one step back just because like the first section of my book is sort of on this aesthetic empathy. And as I'm saying, it's kind of waning as a kind of aesthetic term, but psychologists of art are pretty interested in it. So they're doing all these studies in the 20s and 30s of like how we feel into form, how we might experience weight, like when we see like what looks like a heavy object being depicted or something. So it's and then a lot of the empathy literature is also about kinesthetic. So it's bodily. So that's another aspect. So one part I talk about early in the book is modern dance. So that comes, to the fore in the 20s. It's non-narrative. So it's not about a story. So you're just looking at movements on a stage. And so one of the main theorists of art, John Martin, he's writing for the New York Times, he reads all this empathy literature and says that basically as a viewer, you have to sit there and inside you're kind of simulating, you're moving along. You can feel that movement in your own body in some imaginative, simulated way. And that is how you appreciate modern dance because you're not listening to a story and, so it's different. So that kinesthetic empathy, the body mimicking, in my book, I have one picture. It was in a 1939 textbook where you have a pole vaulter going over a pole and raising his leg, and then you have the trainer raising his leg in imitation. And that was just captioned empathy. So it was really physical. That was also really different. Like we don't really talk, we might say, okay, you're imitating someone, you're gesturing like them, but that's not empathy. Empathy is much more mental. So that was another part of the sort of artistic, kinesthetic empathy. And that kind of fades out again by kind of mid-century. So that's kind of the first third of the book. And then I sort of talk about what happens mid-century. And that's when World War II happens. And after World War II, there's a huge burst in interest in psychology. Psychoanalysis is really popular. Clinical psychology takes off. There are all these war veterans that need help. All these counseling services are, developed. So that is, and then empathy kind of comes out of the academy more or less and gets introduced to the public. And that's like post-World War II, like late 40s. And then what you see is kind of a lot of different kind of empathy still, as you're saying, like counseling empathy is kind of that emotional empathy, I would say, more or less. Like you're really feeling what, your client is feeling. I have to say, though, if you talk about Carl Rogers, who, kind of looms large in my book, but he's big on empathy as a clinical psychologist in the post-World War II period. He says you feel as if you had that experience, but the as if means it's never quite your experience. So I think that's really important. So then there is a whole line that kind of would be in that realm of emotional empathy. But then there's another one, as you were mentioning, called predictive or cognitive empathy, where it's like, can I figure out, like some of the earliest empathy tests were like, can I figure out what kind of magazines factory workers would like? And that was like predicting how groups of people might act. So very cognitive, very rational. Um, so yeah, I think those two get divided probably after World War II. And we're kind of still in that realm where we still kind of recognize those two main forms.
Although now layered onto that is the neuroscience, right?
Yeah.
So what did you learn about the neuroscience of empathy that really touched you or left you thinking differently?
Well, I lived through the whole time when mirror neurons were kind of became incredibly fashionable. And I start that last chapter because I was doing a teaching tutorial or something, how to become a better teacher as performer. And the instructor, she just kept talking about mirror neurons the whole time. Like if I do this, then I'm activating my, audience's mirror neurons. And I was like, wow, this idea has so disseminated. And that had, that mirror neurons were discovered in the mid 90s by these Italian researchers, and it kind of took off as a kind of, these kind of neurons that fired when you saw someone or when a monkey, because they were based in monkey research, like visual motor neurons was what they were called. So if the monkey saw a movement, the same neuron would fire as the monkey would do the same movement himself. So it's like if I watch you do the movement, that same neuron's firing. And so there was a huge amount of research on how this is going to explain empathy, imitation, learning, language. It kind of went off the charts. So I do talk about that in the book and the popularization. And then by the, I don't know, 2014-ish, there became to be some critiques, and maybe this was a little overblown. And actually, the neuroscience is really very complicated because there's that line of research, which again isn't popularized as much anymore. But there are other researchers that look at pain, the experience of pain. They talk about multifactorial empathy, so that there are different circuits you can kind of disaggregate, cognitive empathy from, or perspective taking, as it's called, from an emotional empathy. So there's it's a very complicated picture. And I think the mirror neuron thing was really great to kind of simplify it all. But if you ask a lot of the neuroscientists, it's much more complicated. And it also was hard to go from the monkey model to the human model. In the monkey model, they could test individual neurons. When it transferred to the human model, all of a sudden they couldn't test in obviously the same ways, too invasive. And it became a system model, like the mirror neuron system. So it's very much located in different parts of the brain. And then all of a sudden it became very complex. So I think the neuroscience is fascinating and it keeps changing. But I think there's a number of neuroscientists who see it as a multidimensional system.
Susan, I want to ask you to offer what comes up for you when I read back some of your words, okay? Because one of my favorite quotes from your book reads as follows. It's the last sentence, but I want to give a little context. So I'm going to read back a bit. Empathy depends on movement between the poles of similarity and difference, of distance and closeness, of immersion and alienation. And here's the one sentence I love. Empathy marks a relation between the self and the other that draws a border, but also builds a bridge.
Yeah, I think that's from the introduction, right?
Yes, it is. Tell me more. Tell me more.
Yeah, I really, I think I'm still fascinated by empathy, and maybe we'll get to this later because I'm thinking, am I done with empathy, thinking about it? No, or working on it? No. Well, you understand, you're still working on it too. But because it was this idea of projection originally, and there are experiments now they do where they say, okay, imagine yourself, well, actually, Batson, who did a ton of experiments with empathy, the psychologist, he tried to distinguish, the story about a girl losing her parents. And he had two conditions. He said, okay, one, I want you to imagine this girl, Katie, losing her parents. And then he was, kind of assessing empathic response. And then he said, the second condition is I want you to imagine you losing your parents as this young girl. And so those two situations, and in a number of tests, have been, again, divided so that there are different responses when we imagine ourselves having this experience that someone else is having, or when we imagine that other person having that experience. And to me, that is so fascinating because it's how do we use the self to understand the other, I think, is the main question of empathy, right? Because we're using our capacities, we're using ourself. But isn't that in some ways a contradiction? Like, there's someone else, they're not you. They're sitting aside from you. So how do you use yourself? And the fact that empathy was projection meant you could take the self and kind of, place it on the other, maybe mistakenly, then not understanding their experience. And then when I was reading a lot of Carl Rogers' work as a psychologist, he would talk about stripping the self of judgment, moralistic ideas. It's like you have to let go of all of that in order to really be a good empathizer. So in that way, it's a losing of the self. You can't take yourself with you, you have to say, okay, I don't really understand the situation. I have to be open. I have to not come in with these presumptions and projections. So the fact that empathy has meant both things and that it's so challenging, I think, and it's so interesting um, way to try to reach people. And I just came down to this idea that it is never going to be an identity. And I go back to Jean de Sete, who I quote a lot, who's a neuroscientist, and he says this emotional resonance, just like you feel bad, I feel bad. That's not empathy. I mean, you can define it as that. But he says empathy is when you have self-awareness and emotional regulation. And to me, that is the full, more the full-fledged empathy. So it's like, you are never that person. There's always going to be a border. There always will be a difference. But it doesn't mean that difference is unbridgeable. But I think that to me is still part of the structure of empathy. And then I go back to Edith Stein, who I read a lot about her, but I didn't put her in the book. But she wrote her dissertation under the famous phenomenologist Edmund Husserl. And she was the one that actually said, I want to write about empathy. This is 1916. And she says, by definition, you are empathizing with an experience that is not your own. So it cannot be as immediate as your own. And sometimes I think that gets lost because we just think about empathy as like, oh, you feel bad, I feel bad, or I understand your feeling because I can have the same feeling. But I think that difference is just part of the structure of empathy. And so I do still think, even after going through all these varieties in the history, I still kind of ascribe to that model.
Yeah, I mean, Jeremy Rifkin, The Empathic Civilization, was a book that was quite formative for me as I was thinking about empathy, writing the dissertation. And I don't have any quotes off the top of my head, but the general sentiment that I felt from him was that empathy was a useful attribute or innate capacity that humans have that diminishes difference and sort of puts us on the same level playing field. And so I took that a little further. I'd really love to hear your feedback on sort of the way I frame empathy. So on first pass, I really differentiate empathy from these other words. I put them on a continuum where you've got pity, sympathy, compassion, and empathy.
Mm-hmm.
And on the pity side of the continuum, there's this sense of power asymmetry embedded in the relationship. You pity someone,
Right.
down on them. And on the empathy side, there is this sense of a recognition of common humanity, that we all have access to the myriad emotions that humans are capable of and that we feel over time in our life through our life experiences. But that empathy might be something that unites us in a common humanity, but that we cannot discount or deny lived experience that does still other us. So I feel like that's the same thing when you're saying empathy marks a relation between the self and the other that draws a border, but also builds a bridge. I feel like that's the feeling that that's the idea.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I mean, pity is right, that kind of looking down upon, so the power differential is really obvious. And so um I think empathy does the similarity or the connection you find with empathy is, yes, maybe we share something, right? And what is that? A common humanity, maybe a kind of an emotion in a certain circumstance. Um, I mean, I guess it would depend on each particular case, but it is that. I mean, if it's a human to human, then maybe it is that we share that kind of common humanity or common emotion. But then again, as you're saying, you say lived experience or situation or circumstance, or that might all color that either emotion or feeling in a particular way. The history might give it more weight, right? If you've been abused, say, it's like over history, right? One instance of abuse might resonate very differently if you have a whole history than if someone just, I don't know, has some incident of abuse, say. So it's going to resonate, that individual experience. Like I can maybe resonate with, that trauma, say. But if I haven't had that history, it's not going to have that same necessarily import. So yeah, I mean, that's a good way of saying lived experience. But I also, maybe as an historian, I think, history will play a role too. Like maybe not, I mean, maybe that's how what we carry too from our parents or grandparents, maybe it's not always that self-conscious, but it could be social too, like social patterns of discrimination, race-based stuff. I think we do carry with us, or people do carry that. So yeah, I do agree that lived experience adds that aspect of difference. And I just think that's what makes it's like a tension that isn't ever going to be like one doesn't ever go into the other, it's not all difference and it's not all similarities. So there's a tension.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And at the same time, so we've spoken a little bit about I guess, the phenomenology of empathy, the neuroscience of empathy, obviously the history of empathy. But I want to maybe now move into how empathy can be deployed. I don't know if that's the right frame for it, but that empathy is a trait that we have, or something that we can access, a skill that we can develop. There's a lot of different words that people use depending on their frame of reference, but that empathy by itself is a thing. Great that we have this capacity to empathize, but what do we do with the empathy that we can cultivate? And that kind of takes me to a chapter that you have called Empathy, Race, and Politics. And, I wouldn't mind if you could share with anyone watching or reading what you know about the work of Kenneth B. Clark. Because when I read this chapter, I was like, wow, there's so much here. There's so much richness to think about in terms of how our empathy can be leveraged for a better world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he's a really interesting figure. I mean, most people know that the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision to make sure that schools were no longer segregated, to desegregate schools, that just had its anniversary, actually, right? Like the 50s, like 70 years now, just recently. So that decision, which was huge in terms of civil rights era, even though it caused, I mean, there was a lot of, it didn't like solve the problem, certainly. But Kenneth Clark was one of the main architects of that, kind of collecting all the social science data to buttress that decision. And so he was a social psychologist, and he knew that they had to sort of provide a lot of scientific evidence. He had done some of the early studies on children's preference for white or black dolls. That's probably something that people will remember.
So in case people who are listening don't know that research, could you actually describe that? Because it was such a powerful part of this book.
Yeah. So he did research with his wife, Mamie, who actually, I think it was actually her research, because she was getting an advanced degree too. They were both getting doctorates. And they were trying to test young white and black kids whether they would rather play with white or black dolls. And I have to go back to look at all because there were differences in findings in North and South, but the overarching kind of finding that they came up with was that the black children preferred the white dolls, and in some of the descriptions of how they made that choice, they could see that there was kind of an agonizing choice there, so this idea that a white doll was preferential was a sort of a cultural norm. And these were kind of enshrined, and I think they were part of this decision, the social science data for the decision in 1954. I mean, Kenneth Clark had worked as a research assistant for Gunnar Myrdal, who was like a social a sociologist, and they did this huge study of racism in the United States. And so he had been, a social psychologist. He got his degree in the first Black PhD. I think it's from Columbia, if I'm not mistaken. But then he went to teach in City College. And he became a public activist too during the civil rights period. So he would host conversations with Malcolm X and with Martin Luther King Jr. And he set up he and his wife set up I can't remember what it was called, but it was to help youth in the city of Harlem. So it was like a whole center for mentorship, and he did a ton of work with the schools. So he was much, he was a social psychologist, he taught, but he was a public activist. And I think I came across, like, in 1980, he was elected president of the APA, the American Psychological Association, for a year, and he gave a talk on empathy, and that it was you know, it was not remarked enough, it wasn't studied enough, it was overlooked term. So then I started looking into his work, and I realized that he was just a champion for this idea for a very long time. And I think to him, it was about finding, as we were just discussing, finding this commonality and being treated as a human being and not just as a Black person, right? So this idea of humanizing. And he was friends with James Baldwin, who said some very similar things about empathy being that equalizer. Like, if you could just see me as a human, I have a number of quotes, kind of almost that effect from Clark. It would change the dynamic, because basically to be Black in America was to be seen as Black and not necessarily firstly as a human being. So, and he thought about empathy a lot. At one point, he even thought maybe there was some medical way, like, that we could get medication to sort of increase this capacity. And then there was like this big backlash against that. This was like in early 1970s or something. And he also, one thing I also quoted from him was, he wrote, he must have had a lot of white liberal friends, in the academy at the time. And he kind of lambasted them in a New York Times piece, I think it was 1965, and saying these white liberals, they think they're really, great, but they really don't have this capacity for empathy. They just really don't. And because they were kept treating him and others like they couldn't see the humanity here. And I just think it's like a really powerful piece to come out in the 60s and to talk about this capacity that he's really pushing his friends who are supposedly, these white liberal friends are supposedly on the right side, but they're still missing this piece. And I think as a psychologist, he was thinking that they really had to do psychological work in some sense to understand how to reach out in this way, and then to become better activists, because obviously he was about trying to make the world a better place at the same time.
And to read from
Go
the
ahead.
book, I'm going to hold it up again. Empathy.
Yeah.
This book. One of the parts that I've underlined here is Martin Luther King Jr. asked in 1967, not for white pity, but for empathy. Quote, fellow feeling for the person in need, his pain, his agony, and burdens. And then you say, if sentimentalism could empty itself out into an excess of emotion, empathy was intelligent, measured, and reasonable. And Clark believed that the deep identification achieved through empathy leveled power imbalances and formed a conduit to the recognition of the common predicament of human beings. That's what you're talking about, and that's very powerful.
Yeah, and he used the term empathic reason, so in his work. So again, saying this is not just like because he was a kind of sober guy in a lot of ways. He was not just saying, oh, you just have to feel bad for someone else in some kind of mushy, as I said, sentimental way. It was a very reasonable and rational kind of undertaking, but it did involve this feeling for another. So the fact that he pulled those two together, it was also really important in terms of understanding how empathy can, again, have this rational component or thoughtful component. It's not just about feeling bad for another, or feeling bad if someone else is feeling bad again.
And that's why I think empathy is helpful if it's sort of purposeful, because you can embed empathy into public policy. You can embed empathy into, philosophy and a worldview that we carry with us, and how we treat each other. So it's not just the feeling that shows up spontaneously in the moment, but sort of how we show up in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. I was just looking back at the book before this discussion, and I realized I end my book, and maybe this is where the new one should begin, about the importance of training empathy. And this is the other thing that Clark said a lot about. He totally derived, he critiqued the educational system over. I mean, he did a lot for public education and trying to, create some more equality in terms of access and um, for Black children. But he also said our educational systems are all built around competition, and we don't teach empathy. And he said that over and over again. And I kept thinking that at the end too, that think about how as a child you take classes and all sorts of no one expects you to be a math whiz without any training, right? Or even we took home economics. I mean, I don't know, we take gym, we exercise our bodies, we there's a whole range of courses as part of our educational system. But it's this idea of teaching empathy as part of a curriculum, as a like for school age kids, that just, I mean, it does exist here and there now. I'm not saying it doesn't exist anywhere, but it's certainly not codified or standardized or common. And Clark was saying this in the 60s, like there's something really wrong that we are not educating and training people to develop this capacity. And we're training them to be competitive. Who's better than who else? And that's the value we care about, like who's on the top of the heap.
So I know that the empathy bug is still in you, and I want to ask you the question about the project that you have up your sleeve now, the next empathy book, where you're going to explore the varieties of empathy. But just before we do that, I really do want to get this on the podcast because it's the last paragraph. It's not even the full paragraph, but the last few sentences of your book, where you write, empathy dares us to move beyond the habitual borders of the self to reach toward another human being, animal, art object, or the natural world. So I love that extension, that radiation out. We need the self to empathize, but we also have to leave it behind. This is one of empathy's mysteries, but it is also its promise. So tell me, what are you up to now? What's the next empathy frontier?
Well, I mean, it's obviously influenced by looking at this history, and I did go into all these, different niches. There's stuff on psychology and art and neuroscience. But what I want to think about is sort of jumping off from that point, like, what does, and I love your term purposeful empathy, because a lot of this empathy in the original stuff was sort of unconscious. Like when we feel into a form, it just sort of happens, like a lot of that was not aware or deliberate. It's just we happen to sort of respond in some ways. And we can talk about that same way. Well, maybe if someone's crying, we might feel tear up too, right? Because that again is not necessarily deliberate. But your task about how do we make this purposeful, I think, is also something I'm thinking about a lot. But I'm also retaining this idea that empathy has varieties. So I don't, it spells a kind of connection. It kind of, the way I see it, has that kind of structural similarity and difference, and in it, that it's was never going to be necessarily total identity. So we can accommodate difference, but we do have to challenge ourselves in some cases, right, to understand that difference. So how can we think about empathy's varieties? And so I'm trying to kind of almost create a typology of empathy. Like, there would be a kinesthetic one. That one is largely forgotten, but you can see it in like yoga practices and dance and movement, so that's kind of a mind-body connection. There's the self-empathy bit, which I didn't talk about that much in the book, but this idea that we have a connection to ourselves, that, that's of course been buttressed a lot by mindfulness practice and that kind of thing. But the idea also of connecting to art in a certain way, which how we feel into form. I kind of want to revive that and kind of talk about that a bit more. And then this idea, again, taken from Kenneth Clark, of like, rational empathy, or empathic reason, like pulling these things together. And, even some sociologists talked about this in the past, that we do understand someone's circumstance. It's not like we just pinpoint the emotion and that's it. Okay, I see. It's like you feel the emotion, you understand or feel the emotion in the circumstance that the person is inhabiting. So, I mean, these are just a couple of the varieties, but it's sort of more looking at the contemporary scene. So maybe I will draw some from the history, but it's saying that these varieties are open to us, and that, again, like, researchers should kind of be specific about what empathy they're looking at, but we can train ourselves. We can kind of work toward um, developing these different forms of empathy, which are kind of different ways of connecting, more or less.
Makes me think there's indigenous communities in the north that have 50 different words for snow.
Right.
There's different kinds of snow. There's the slushy
Yeah.
snow and the hail snow and the wet, heavy snow and the snow that's like fluffy. And I think there's many, many varieties of empathy. And we just use this one word as this monolith. And that's why there's some confusion around it. And I don't think
Yeah.
we're going to get like the general public to know all of the different varieties and have them, very clear in our minds. But you'll do the work for us so that we understand, oh yes, there is this different kind of empathy. And I so look forward to reading about the kinesthetic empathy that you write about, because I've noticed, having spent a lot of time in my head over the last few years working on the book, and I had the same experience on the PhD, that I want to move my body more.
Yeah.
We are like a living system, and the feelings happen through the body. It's not just
Right.
an intellectual thing. So
Right.
let me ask as the last question, Susan. Thank you so much. This has been so
Yeah,
great.
really
I'm
fun.
so
It's
lived up
like revisiting my book that I, wrote
to
6 years ago, but
it's a great book. Let me hold it
mostly I
again.
remember things.
Pardon me?
I said I mostly remember everything, not every name or something.
No, you did a great job. Holy
Yeah.
smokes. And I just threw some questions at you that you had no idea were coming. Um, the last question I ask on my podcast is a personal nature. So
Yeah.
we've had access to you as a historian and as somebody who's now learned on the topic of empathy, but now you as a person, can you think of a time in your life when you were on the receiving end of empathy and what that meant for you?
Yeah. So so not to, kind of advertise a piece, but I wrote a short piece that I published last fall in the Harvard Divinity Bulletin, because I actually have a degree in religious studies back when. Um, and uh so this little anecdote is part of that piece, and so it has like a bigger context, but basically that piece is kind of a personal piece about me, finishing my book, thinking about empathy, taking walks around Walden Pond, because I live very close to Concord, reading Ralph Waldo Emerson and all the transcendentalists, and then thinking about, perhaps, did they have a concept of empathy, even though they didn't use the word. um, and I was on this sort of journey of the transcendentalists. And the moment was, I was doing research, and I went, I was in my study, or my husband's study, picked up a book that was about a transcendentalist. And I opened it up, and it had an inscription from my mother in it. So basically I had, it was about Fuller. So I had given her the book, and she had given it back to me. And that very day, I had taken my mother. She had Alzheimer's, so I was looking at a memory um, disorders setting to put her in. But I stood there and I started reading her inscription, which was, here's a book that you gave me, and now I'm giving it back to you. And I was on this sort of journey of like learning about transcendentalism. So it just really struck me. And I'm standing there and I start to cry. And my son, who's like 17, and he's playing video games in the next room. And I didn't say anything to him, but he just looks up and he says, "Mom, are you okay?" And he walks over to me, and for him to notice, like, and then he comes over and I show him, this is grandma who, and he kind of knew where she was at that point. So, and he reads the inscription, and it was just this moment. And I write about it in the piece because I just felt like his recognition and connection with me reconnected me with my mother of times past, and also connected them. It was like this kind of sad but very nice moment. But it also was, I mean, him just coming to me. And when you're 17 and like playing video games as a boy, it's not always something that, you know, oh, mom, what's going on with you? So it was very touching.
That is a beautiful story. I'm very moved by it. And, there's the sexy factor to use the word superpower. Empathy is our superpower. But if you dip into it, like what you just shared, empathy is a superpower. It does connect us beyond what we can put words to necessarily. I think that's just a perfect example of that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Susan, for sharing.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it was a long build-up. Sorry. But anyway.
Well, I'm going to include, if it's public, if this piece is public.
Yeah. It's called, let's see, what is it called? A Heart-Shaped Rock, because it's also about objects. So kind of feeling into objects a bit. And it was published in the Harvard Divinity Bulletin in, I think, December. But
fantastic.
It's a little more personal. What?
We're going to include that in the show notes so people who are taken by this story can now,
It's a short piece. It's not like reading a book,
right? But if you're going to read a book, this is the one to pick up.
Okay. Thank you, Anita. This was fun.
Thank you so much. And thank you for everyone who was listening and watching. And we'll see you next week at Purposeful Empathy. Thanks so much for watching another episode of Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. So now the invitation is to subscribe to the channel and consider picking up a copy of Purposeful Empathy. Thanks again for watching. Have a great day.